A simple woman was ridiculed at a gala event until she revealed she was the main sponsor. Margaret Wilson had never been comfortable with attention. At 52, she preferred her modest two-bedroom apartment in Queens and the simple routines that structured her days. The subway commute to her office in Manhattan, where she quietly managed investments worth billions, was her daily meditation. Few knew that the unassuming woman in practical shoes and minimal makeup had transformed a small inheritance into a fortune through strategic investment. The invitation to the Harrington Foundation annual gala arrived on embossed cardstock, addressed to Ms. Margaret Wilson, CEO, Horizon Investment. She almost discarded it, as she had done with similar invitations over the years. The thought of mingling with New York's elite made her stomach knot. Yet this particular charity supported education initiatives in underserved communities, a cause that resonated with Margaret. "You should go," urged Diane, her assistant of 15 years, and perhaps the only person who truly knew Margaret. "The foundation needs sponsors, and you've been anonymous long enough." Margaret fingered the invitation, remembering her mother's words. "Your worth isn't measured by others' approval." She had lived by that philosophy, building her empire quietly while maintaining her humble lifestyle. That evening, Margaret stood before her modest wardrobe, nothing suitable for a black tie event. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman with kind eyes and smile lines, features that spoke of character rather than privilege. She dialed her sister. "Janet, I need advice on something completely out of my comfort zone." Hours later, they found a simple black dress at a department store. Nothing designer, but elegant in its simplicity. "You look beautiful," Janet assured her. "Just be yourself." Margaret wasn't convinced, but nodded anyway. What Janet didn't understand was that Margaret had spent decades being invisible in rooms full of powerful people. It was how she gathered information, made connections, and built her success. As she paid for the dress, Margaret remembered her first investment meeting. The memory strengthened her resolve. This gala wasn't about acceptance. It was about supporting a cause she believed in. The morning of the gala, Margaret woke before her alarm. Anxiety had become her unwelcome companion. She followed her usual routine: coffee, newspaper, emails, finding comfort in the familiar. By noon, her resolve was wavering. "Perhaps I could just increase the donation and skip the event," she suggested, when Diane called to check in. "Margaret," Diane's voice was gentle but firm, "you've spent your life hiding behind spreadsheets. Maybe it's time people saw the woman behind the success." Margaret sighed, knowing Diane was right. Her reluctance wasn't just about discomfort, it was fear. Fear of judgment, of not belonging, of being seen as an imposter among those born into privilege. As afternoon approached, Margaret visited a salon, another rarity. The stylist suggested a dramatic transformation, but Margaret opted for a simple updo. "I still want to recognize myself," she explained. Back home, Margaret carefully applied makeup, remembering tips from a YouTube tutorial she'd watched the night before. The black dress hung ready. She added her mother's pearl earrings, her only inherited jewelry. Margaret's thoughts drifted to her childhood. Her father, a factory worker, instilled in her the value of hard work. Her mother taught her to save and invest, no matter how small the amount. Her phone chimed. The car service had arrived. For a moment, Margaret considered texting cancellation. Instead, she gathered her courage along with her purse. The drive to Manhattan's Upper East Side passed in a blur of self-doubt. The venue, a historic mansion converted into an event space, loomed impressive against the twilight sky. Liveried staff directed guests up marble steps. Women in designer gowns and men in impeccable tuxedos ascended with practiced ease. Margaret hesitated at the base of the stairs, feeling conspicuously ordinary. Her dress, while nice, lacked the luxury labels evident on others. At the entrance, she presented her invitation. The hostess scanned the list. her perfectly shaped eyebrow rising slightly. "Ms. Wilson, of Horizon Investments?" "Yes," Margaret answered, recognizing the surprise. People expected CEOs to look imposing, not like someone's unassuming aunt. "Welcome to the Harrington Gala." The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes as she directed Margaret toward the grand ballroom. 40 minutes into the event, Margaret remained largely unnoticed. She had made polite conversation with a server about the canapes and exchanged pleasantries with an elderly gentleman who seemed as out of place as she felt. First time at the Harrington Gala? Margaret turned to find a woman approximately her age, elegantly dressed in emerald green. Unlike most attendees, her smile seemed genuine. "Is it that obvious?" Margaret asked. "Only to another outsider." The woman extended her hand. "Rebecca Winters. My husband's company recently joined the foundation's corporate sponsor." "Margaret Wilson." She shook Rebecca's hand, grateful for the connection. "So, what brings you here, Margaret? Business networking or genuine philanthropy?" "The foundation's education initiatives," Margaret replied honestly. "I believe in creating opportunity." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a group of women, all impeccably styled and exuding confidence born of privilege. "Rebecca, darling," the apparent leader of the group, a blonde with an ageless face that spoke of expensive procedures, air-kissed Rebecca's cheeks. "We've been looking everywhere for you," Rebecca introduced Margaret, but the women's interest visibly dimmed upon learning she wasn't a recognizable name or face. "And what do you do, Margaret?" asked one, her tone suggesting limited possibilities. "I work in investment management," Margaret answered simply. "How interesting," said another with practiced politeness. "My husband's portfolio manager just purchased the most exquisite summer home in the Hamptons. Perhaps you know him, Bradford Stevens with Legacy Capital." Margaret did know of Bradford Stevens, a mediocre investor with excellent social connection. "I'm not familiar with him," she replied diplomatically. The women exchanged glances. "And which firm are you with?" the blonde asked. "Horizon Investment. I'm the CEO." This information was met with poorly concealed skepticism. Horizon was known in financial circles, but maintained a low profile. "Horizon? I don't believe I've heard Elliot mention them," said the blonde, referencing her husband, whom Margaret recognized as a prominent hedge fund manager. The conversation shifted, effectively excluding Margaret. Comments about exclusive vacation destinations, private school admissions, and recently acquired artwork flowed around her. Occasional glances in her direction suggested they were evaluating her modest appearance against her claimed position. The program's intermission brought renewed social activity. Margaret excused herself, needing a moment of respite. In the elegant powder room, she overheard two women discussing her. The woman in the plain black dress, claiming to be some CEO? Exactly. Caroline did a quick search. Horizon Investments exists, but the CEO listed is M. Wilson, probably her boss. Margaret entered their line of sight, and conversation abruptly ceased. She washed her hands unhurriedly, maintaining dignity despite the flush creeping up her neck. Returning to the ballroom, Margaret considered leaving. The foundation already had her donation. Her physical presence seemed increasingly unnecessary. As she contemplated a graceful exit, Andrew Harrington approached with an elderly gentleman. "Ms. Wilson, may I introduce Professor James Caldwell? He heads our education initiative in East Harlem." The professor's handshake was firm, his eyes bright with intelligence. "Miss Wilson, a pleasure. Andrew tells me you're interested in our work." This genuine conversation was refreshing. Professor Caldwell described the program's impact on first-generation college students, while Margaret asked thoughtful questions about metrics and outcomes. Their discussion attracted attention. The blonde and her friends hovered nearby, clearly curious about Margaret's apparent connection to important figures. "Margaret," the blonde interrupted sweetly, "we didn't properly introduce ourselves earlier. I'm Caroline Westfield. My husband chairs the Metropolitan Museum Board." Margaret acknowledged the introduction politely, but returned her focus to Professor Caldwell. This seemed to irritate Caroline. "I don't believe I've seen you at these events before," Caroline persisted. "Are you new to New York?" "I've lived here for 30 years, Margaret replied. "I simply don't attend many galas." "Oh, what circles do you typically move in?" The question's intent was clear: to establish Margaret's social standing, or lack thereof. "I'm afraid I don't move in circles," Margaret answered honestly. "I work, primarily." Caroline's smile tightened. "Fascinating. And you said you're with Horizon Investment. As the CEO?" Her tone made the title sound implausible. Professor Caldwell interjected, "Ms. Wilson's support has been instrumental in expanding our scholarship program." This revelation visibly surprised Caroline and her friends. The dynamic shifted subtly as they reassessed Margaret's potential value to their social network. "We should connect," Caroline suggested with newfound warmth. "My husband often seeks investment opportunities." The investment discussion around the table was predictably superficial. Elliot Westfield, Caroline's husband, held court with the confidence of a man accustomed to deference. His analysis of emerging markets contained several fundamental misconceptions, but the group nodded appreciatively. "Southeast Asian markets are essentially interchangeable," Elliot pronounced with unwarranted certainty. "And African investment, pure speculation with minimal returns. My strategy is to avoid both entirely." Margaret noticed several guests nodding, despite Elliot's oversimplification, ignoring the complex economic realities of diverse regions. "What are your thoughts, Margaret?" Elliot asked, his tone suggesting he expected either agreement or confusion. Margaret considered her response carefully. Her mind quickly calculated whether correcting him would be worth the inevitable social friction. This was precisely the kind of moment when staying invisible had served her well in the past. Yet something, perhaps the cumulative weight of being dismissed all evening, propelled her toward honesty. While there's merit in considering GDP growth projection, currency stability factors significantly into risk assessment. The Brazilian real, for instance, shows concerning volatility patterns despite positive economic indicators. Vietnam and Indonesia have shown remarkably different trajectories despite regional proximity, she added, her voice quiet but firm. And several African nations have outperformed European markets over the past decade when portfolio diversification is properly structured to mitigate currency risk. A moment of silence followed. "Hold, secretary," Elliot blinked, clearly surprised by her informed response. "That's an interesting perspective," he managed. "Where did you say you worked again?" "Horizon Investments." "Right, as the..." He paused skeptically. "CEO and founder," Margaret completed. Caroline laughed lightly. "Forgive me, but Horizon must be quite boutique. I've never heard Elliot mention it, and he knows everyone in finance." Margaret merely smiled. She had spent decades being underestimated and had learned that defensiveness only reinforced others. Misconceptions. The conversation shifted to safer topic: recent art acquisitions, private school admissions scandals, summer plans in exclusive locations. Margaret contributed minimally, increasingly certain she would not be attending future social events. The evening's formal conclusion approached. Andrew Harrington took the stage to thank sponsors and announce the gala's fundraising total. Margaret prepared to make a discreet exit during the applause. "Before we conclude," Andrew continued, "I want to acknowledge our foundation's supporters. While some prefer anonymity, their impact deserves recognition." Margaret tensed. Surely he wouldn't. Our education initiative has recently received transformative funding that will expand our program to 5 additional schools. This extraordinary gift came from Horizon Investment, under the leadership of its founder and CEO, Margaret Wilson. The room's collective attention swiveled toward Margaret. Caroline's expression froze in mid-sip of champagne. "Ms. Wilson has been a silent supporter of our foundation for years," Andrew continued. "Her company's investment strategies have generated billions while maintaining a deliberate low profile. We're honored by her presence tonight and her commitment to educational equality." Applause erupted, accompanied by murmurs of surprise. A ripple of reassessment swept through the ballroom as guests who had ignored or dismissed her all evening suddenly searched their memories for any potentially embarrassing interaction. Several people who had barely acknowledged her presence earlier now angled to make eye contact, their expressions transformed by the revelation of her financial significance. Margaret remained composed, despite her discomfort with the spotlight. A lifetime of invisibility had not prepared her for this moment of exposure. She felt a curious mix of vindication and vulnerability as the weight of all those evaluating gazes pressed upon her. The pearl earrings suddenly felt heavy against her neck. She nodded acknowledgement, maintaining the dignity that had carried her through the evening. Caroline was already making her way across the room, her expression recalibrated from condescension to calculated warmth, while Elliot straightened his tie, clearly preparing to restart their investment conversation with a markedly different tone. Margaret's alarm sounded at the usual time the morning after the gala. Her routine resumed: coffee, newspaper, emails, but something had shifted. Her phone displayed numerous notifications, LinkedIn connection requests, emails from people she'd met briefly, messages from old contacts who had suddenly remembered her existence. The most surprising message came from Andrew Harrington, apologizing for revealing her identity despite her preference for anonymity. "I observed how you were being treated," he wrote. "Sometimes recognition serves a greater purpose than humility." Margaret wasn't entirely convinced, but appreciated his intention. She replied graciously, reaffirming her commitment to the Foundation's work. At her office, Diane greeted her with undisguised curiosity. "So, how was it?" Margaret considered the question while hanging her coat. "Educational," she finally answered. "Did they fawn over you once they knew who you were?" Diane asked eagerly. "Some did." It was exactly as insincere as you'd imagine. Diane looked disappointed. "So, it was a complete waste of time." "Not entirely," Margaret said, surprising herself with the realization. "I met someone I might actually become friends with, and the education program director invited me to speak with their students." "You? Public speaking?" Diane's eyebrows rose. Margaret smiled. Apparently, the gala was a night for unlikely events. Throughout the day, Margaret found herself reflecting on the experience. The social rejection had stung, certainly, but less than she'd anticipated. What lingered was the memory of Caroline Westfield's transparent transformation from dismissive to sycophantic. The experience had reinforced what Margaret had always suspected about wealth and status in New York society. People like Carolyn didn't value others for their character or contributions, but for what they could provide: connections, opportunities, validation. It was a transactional existence that Margaret had deliberately avoided throughout her career. "Margaret, the Thompson Portfolio Review is ready." Diane interrupted her thoughts, placing a folder on her desk. "And Elliot Westfield called. Twice. He says it's about exciting investment synergies." Margaret suppressed a smile. "Tell him I'm in meetings all day, and possibly all month." "With pleasure," Diane replied with a knowing look. "Also, Rebecca Winters called. She didn't leave a message about business opportunities, just asked if you'd like to see that new exhibition at the Met." That call, Margaret decided, she would return personally. By evening, Margaret had received 3 separate lunch invitations from Caroline, each more effusive than the last. She decided to respond to the third. "Dear Caroline, thank you for your kind invitation. While my schedule doesn't permit lunch in the near future, I'd be happy to make a donation to any of the charitable boards you mentioned. Causes supporting education are of particular interest. Regards, Margaret Wilson." A week later, Margaret found herself in an East Harlem classroom, speaking to 30 students in the Harrington Foundation's college preparation program. These teenagers, bright-eyed and attentive, wanted to know how she'd built her company, what obstacles she'd overcome, what advice she could offer. For them, Margaret set aside her aversion to public speaking. She shared her journey from a small Pennsylvania town to Manhattan's financial world, emphasizing persistence over pedigree. "Most people in my industry come from prestigious backgrounds," she told them. "I didn't. That felt like a disadvantage until I realized it gave me perspective. Others lacked. Sometimes being underestimated is an opportunity in disguise." A girl in the front row raised her hand. "Sus, weren't you angry when people dismissed you?" Margaret considered this thoughtfully. "Sometimes, but anger consumes energy better spent proving your worth through actions rather than arguments. The world will often tell you who it thinks you are," Margaret continued, surprising herself with her candor. "Your job isn't to argue with that perception, but to quietly prove it wrong. Success isn't about being seen, it's about seeing clearly yourself." The students nodded, some scribbling notes, others watching her intently. Their earnestness moved her more than any gala could. In their faces, Margaret recognized her younger self, determined, hopeful, unaware of the specific obstacles ahead, but prepared to face them nonetheless. After the talk, Professor Caldwell introduced her to several students who hoped to pursue careers in finance. Their questions were insightful, their ambitions inspiring. Margaret found herself offering internship opportunities at Horizon Investments, something she'd rarely done before. "You've made quite an impression," Professor Caldwell noted as the students filed out. "We'd be honored if you'd consider becoming a regular mentor in our program."